This is something that humans have been thinking about for thousands of years. We were conceiving of humanoid robots, in third century BC China, automata. And so it's amazing, right? We're now at this point in human history, 1,000 years from now, we'll all have been alive at this moment where it was suddenly possible to do this, to build machines that can do some of the things that we do. And so we don't need to overstate sort of where we're at.
Hey everybody, it's Brian Heater. You are watching or listening to the Automated Podcast by A3. Got a great episode this week, and in fact, as I am recording this intro, we are just coming off a week of conferences. We had the Humanoid Robotic Forum and the two-day focus event. At the Humanoid Robotic Forum, one of my fireside chats was with this gentleman, Jeff Cardenas, somebody who I always enjoy talking with. Incredibly nice guy. That's, not something that you always get when you speak with executives, CEOs at startups, and also very, very candid and straightforward. And that's something that I've found with him from the beginning. And again, that is not something that you always get with executives at startups. So please enjoy this talk with him, talking about some of the hopefulness, but also the pragmatism and some of the issues that humanoid robotic startups have coming in the next few years. So thanks to Jeff, thanks to Apptronik. Please like and subscribe to the podcast if you like it and would like more episodes. Then those are the things to do. And I will see you on the other side of the interview. So I wanted to start by, I don't want to say clearing up, but giving a little more context for myself and other people who are listening. When we talk about pilots, like the one that your Apptronik is doing with Mercedes, what does that actually look like in practice?
There's multiple stages to a pilot. It's basically an iterative process where we're bringing robots on site. We're testing a variety of things. I sort of think of a pilot as two stages. First stage of the pilot is, can the robot actually do the thing that you're trying to do with metrics that make sense, right? And so we're climbing this sort of ladder in terms of skills and capabilities. We're doing that on site. We're learning as we're going through the pilot stage. The next stage of the pilot is more around integration, security, safety, certifications. The way to sort of think about it is it doesn't make sense to do the second piece until you've solved the first piece. So I think you can handle pilots in a different way. But for us, it's really about, getting the robots on site into the environment and really testing out the capabilities of the robots in a production environment. And then in the backside of that, really working on integration and all the things you need to work through to get towards, real commercial uptake.
Yeah, I think it's important to clarify, just because I'm not sure that there is a super consistent idea of what a pilot is when people talk about them. So expectations are kind of different. I'm going to date this, but as we're recording this, it's been an issue with another humanoid company recently, like what the scope of a pilot looks like. But it's hard. To a certain extent, it must be difficult to be super transparent about it because you're kind of beholden to the company that you're working with.
Yeah, I think so. And I also think not all pilots are the same for everyone. So when you're dealing with, different, very large organizations, and you're really just working on proving out the capabilities of the product and technologies in a real world environment. And so that can take different shapes in terms of how you're going to approach that. I think for us, the important thing is, it's still the beginning of humanoids getting out into the world. And so there's still a lot to learn and to mature in order to have, fully commercially ready humanoid robots. The thing that I like to say is we're in the commercial viability stage where we're really proving out the capabilities that these are commercially viable before we can get to like the commercial uptake. Like we have a turnkey humanoid that you can drop on site and it can just do all of the work. at the rate and cost that we hope for down the road.
Yeah, that's something that I've always appreciated about you in conversations that we've had is, you tend to be pretty pragmatic. You tend to be pretty transparent. And it strikes me that, maybe to a certain extent, your job is, if not tempering expectations, then at least setting like realistic expectations about things like timeline and scaling.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I try to do that. I've been dreaming about this stuff since I was a kid, and I've spent most of my adult life now trying to commercialize humanoids. Not for the faint of heart over the last decade. I think an interesting point that I like to make is that this is something that humans have been thinking about for thousands of years. We were conceiving of humanoid robots, in third century BC China, automata. And so it's amazing, right? We're now at this point in human history, 1,000 years from now, we'll all have been alive at this moment where it was suddenly possible to do this, to build machines that can do some of the things that we do. And so we don't need to overstate sort of where we're at. Like, that's an amazing moment. And now this technology, I mean, we've been working on this for a decade to mature it from the lab and to get it out into the real world. And it's here, but it's early, it's the beginning. And so I think that's enough to be excited about. And so I think we just want to be mindful of what that's going to take and what that's going to look like, so that people are properly calibrated, and that we have credibility. We as an industry, as a humanoid industry or sector maybe of the robotics industry, we really spent a lot of time trying to gain credibility of humanoids. Coming off the DARPA Robotics Challenge, a lot of people were very skeptical about the commercial viability of humanoids. And so we've tried to really be, thoughtful about how we do this. And there's really smart, credible people, both at the customer site and at the developer site, really working on this. And we have reached an inflection point, and that's really exciting. But, there's still a lot of work ahead, as we're moving forward.
Yeah, let's say hypothetically there was another humanoid robotics company in the sort of general area that you're in Austin. Let's say it rhymes with Besla, hypothetically. In terms of these like unrealistic timelines and expectations, is that something that can ultimately just do damage to the space at large?
Well, I think a lot of these things are a double-edged sword. So I think, that company is generally optimistic and very aggressive about timelines, but has ultimately delivered on many of the things that they've aimed to do, even if not, directly in the timelines. And so I think in for the space overall, it has captured the imagination of the public. But I do think if you're not careful about it on the other side, that you could disappoint a lot of people. I think it's early for humanoids in the industrial space, period. I think it's certainly early for humanoids in the home. And so I think just, I want a robot in my house. I'm tired of folding laundry and doing all these things, but I think it's early. And I think we just want to make sure that we're sort of tempering ambition with, what's realistic. Because like I said, humans have been conceiving of humanoid robots longer than we've conceived of computers, right? We had this, what if you had a mechanical human that could do all the things that you didn't want to do? Like, this has been in our consciousness for a long time. And now here we are. We're in 2025. We can do it. We have real humanoid robots, and that's amazing. So let's not overblow things. Let's make sure that we're mindful about expectations, and do it right.
Yeah, when we talk about home robots, it strikes me that to a certain extent, robotic vacuums have been kind of an evolutionary dead end. I mean, they're continuing to improve on them. They're doing mapping and things like that. But in the 20 plus years that Roomba's been on the market, it hasn't, led to a fundamental sea change when it comes to getting robots in the home. Now we're having a conversation about having it like approaching it from the entirely different direction, approaching it from like highly complex, highly expensive machines, starting in industry, and then eventually making their way into the home. Do you feel like with the work that you're doing that there's a straight shot from a warehouse to a house?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if straight shot. I don't know if there's many straight shots in this space. Some of these are sort of meandering approaches. We're learning a lot still today. Um, but I do think I do think we will have humanoids in the home. I think we'll have robots in the home. I think they'll be general purpose. I sort of think about, you know, do you want C3PO or R2D2? And I don't think they'll all be humanoids, though I think if you have to bet on the form factor, that will I always use the analogy of the personal computer. Like, what's the form factor that could scale to sort of the mass market? I think it's most likely to be some type of humanoid, whether it's legs or wheeled or, a hybrid of those. Um, but yes, I do think if you're smart about it, that you that the building blocks and the things that we're learning in the industrial space will pave the way for robots in the home. And I'm happy to dive into deeper about how you do that. But yes, I do.
Yeah, well, that's it's really interesting to me because I've kind of come to this realization over the last year or two that it it strikes me that legs are perhaps even more necessary in a home setting than in a warehouse setting. Is that fair?
Potentially, yeah. Yeah.
Because the warehouses, factories, we're talking about controlled environment. Homes are notoriously difficult because of there are stairs and there's your clothing and you're rearranging and things like that. So, but you did take this kind of again a fairly measured approach onto the market. I'm not sure like people are super familiar with this, but prior to showing off the leg robot, you showed off a wheeled robot, right? Which was really essentially similar or same Apollo torso on wheels. Are wheels still a part of your roadmap or your overall plan?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for me, what we want in general is we want versatile robots, right? We want robots that are capable of doing many things. And then the question is, how do you get there? When you think about humanoid robots, really the sort of premise is if you want to get to versatility, you have to have retrofitability because the challenge for robotics has been that you have to modify the environment, and that's created a huge barrier to uptake. There's been something called pilot purgatory where you get, unless you're 99.99% effective, then people don't want to modify their whole workflow around the robot, and so the bar for robotic uptake has been very high. If you have a versatile robot that just retrofits into the world, then that really lowers the bar, reduces a lot of the friction, and enables potentially mass adoption. So versatility is really the name of the game. There are places where you can retrofit a humanoid style robot into that environment and you can put it on wheels. And so I think of, you could have maybe three versions of humanoids where you could have an upper body torso that's even stationary mounted. You're working at a workstation and it's just, the upper torso. You have a legged system, which is the most capable, most versatile, most mass market. And then you have the wheeled version. So yeah, well, that's a part of the portfolio. The way that we've learned over time, though, is that the jump from a wheeled system to a legged system is a massive jump. So the system complexity, the whole body dynamics of the system really change. And so if you go from wheels to legs, the problem explodes on you. Um, if you take the inverse approach, where you actually build the full humanoid and you start with the whole body dynamics, the network complexity of a full humanoid, then you can simplify down to wheels. So the way I always say it is kind of like the full humanoid buys you the wheeled humanoid, but the inverse isn't true, where you could hit a ceiling with just that wheeled humanoid that won't buy you the full sort of long-term vision of what a humanoid could offer.
But for example, like the Mercedes Pilot that's been going on, those are all legged
Those are all
robots,
legs.
right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Those are all
Be-
legs.
because like you said, there's a lot more complexity, but in a lot of ways, we know how to make wheeled robots. People have been doing it for a long time. So that would be kind of a path of less resistance as far as getting those into pilots. But when you're having a conversation with, like a giant car maker, are they insistent that it be legged?
No, I mean, I think what people want is robots to solve their problems, but the inherent value proposition of the humanoid is the versatility, is not the specific task that you're doing, but the range of tasks that they can do over time, right? So, like, what does the 5 year roadmap look like? And how do you work backwards from the 5 year roadmap? And so, the big risk you run in humanoids is that as you push to get them out into the market, you have to be careful that you don't end up with a complicated special purpose robot,
Mm.
right? That the trade-off for additional complexity that buys you versatility versus that you have this system that could be versatile but is actually not, that you're just really just doing one thing. And so what we're working on with our customers is thinking about a 5 year roadmap, all of the things that they want a humanoid robot to do over time, but then working backwards from that and say, like, what is the first application we'll do? But we want to be on this trajectory to achieve a general purpose robot that can do many different things, that can do intermittent tasks, that can do 2 hour tasks or 4 hour tasks. And that's where the value proposition of the humanoid really shines.
So 5 years from now, what does success look like for Apptronik?
Well, I'm a dreamer, so I think that we have robots in a whole host of applications. I think in 5 years from now, we'll start to enter a broader range of commercial applications. I've sort of explained the market is happening in 3 phases, in my opinion. Stage one is industrial applications, so that's logistics and manufacturing. They're already adopting lots of robots today. You can solve a lot of the safety cases by separating the robots in the early stages from people while you're working towards collaborative or cooperative safety standards. Phase two is things like healthcare, hospitality, and retail, where you're starting to mix the robots. You already are seeing humanoids in some of these applications, but in terms of mass market, that's sort of stage two. And then stage three is the home and assistive care, which is the big dream. That's my dream. I've talked about this before, is assistive care long term. So in the next 5 years, I think you'll see us really with tens of thousands of robots out there in the world, maybe more. But I'm trying to be, eyes wide open about sort of what that ramp's going to look like over the next 5 years, and learning a lot as we go through it. And so we're really proving value. We have real production robots out in the world in these industrial applications, and then we're starting to move into these other applications as well. And I sort of think of it as you want to start an initial application that you can prove. You can't do everything if you can't do one thing. So first, the proof of life in these environments, and then you're expanding within that footprint of different things that the robot can do over time. I think the next 2 years will be critical for the industry. This is what I call the commercial viability stage, like really proving that these robots work, that you can show initial tasks where you have positive ROI. And then I think the sky's the limit from there. I think it's going to be an exciting ride for robotics as a whole over the next 5 years.
It's funny because I think there's something in the form factor, and I think there's something in, once you start talking about the humanoid form factor, then you start talking about like AGI and those breakthroughs. And that's why at this, I don't want to say early stage of the company, because the company has technically been around since 2016, but at this early stage, as far as you actually showing off these robots, people are already asking you about what's going to be happening in the home, because I don't think anybody's calling up Locust and asking them when they can get a Locust robot in their house.
Yeah, I think that's true. There's a lot sort of packed into going after the humanoid form factor, right? Like I said, I mean, this is something that I didn't appreciate coming into this. I was, very admittedly naive grad student. I sort of think of that as a good thing. I had no clue how hard this problem was going to be, or even all the history of how many people had tried this and what the failure points had been. I just kind of seemed like an obvious future, and one that I was willing to spend the rest of my life working towards. And we went after it. And we sort of figured, regardless of what happened, it would be worth trying. It was a worthy pursuit of our time. Um, but yeah, there's a lot baked into that when you go after the humanoid form, and we will get there. I do think it's fair to say that it's early. Like, I think of this as sort of the beginning of the next chapter for Apptronik overall. But yeah, it's interesting, all the things that come with it, the good and the bad.
Yeah, so like in your, I'm sure you've done lots of. This is the ex TechCruncher in me talking. I'm sure you've done a lot of pitch decks over the years. When you're doing a pitch deck to an investor, does something like a home setting factor into that pitch?
Well, we talk about it in sort of phases. So I pitched sort of these phases. I mean, I sort of, my dream is to work on something that the work that I do today impacts society 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now. To me, that's how I sort of create meaning. Is I want to make a contribution to the world, to our species, right? And so, I actually start with the big picture, this idea that computers are getting better and better. They're going from the digital to the physical world. This is a robot. And in order for robotics to scale, we need more versatility. So the idea in a pitch deck just starts simple. If we want robots to become an everyday part of our life, they have to be more versatile. And then you say, okay, well, how does that happen? What does the arc of that look like? And then I basically say it's going to happen in these three phases. Think of it as going from easy to hard, right? And all of these things are hard. This is all on a relative basis. And then what I talked about before, sort of stage one, the industrial base, stage two, then broader commercial, stage three is the grand prize. And we're working across this spectrum.
Yeah, so I mentioned the 2016 date before. Do you remember the first time you and I had like a lengthy conversation? Do you remember?
It was at Automate. We sat
It was
down
at
at
Automate.
Automate. Yeah.
We were in the empty cafeteria. I was like sitting like on the side of the empty
Yeah.
cafeteria, and you came down and
Yeah, of course.
you showed me some of the slides early on. But like at that stage, I don't know, Apptronik didn't really have an outward facing presence at the show, right? It was just sort of you going and taking meetings essentially.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, we've had this value from the beginning, which is show versus tell, right? Like we really believe in this, and we really believe in what we're doing, and we're trying to do it right. This is hard stuff to do, and sometimes you make predictions and you might be wrong about those, but we're trying to be really thoughtful about how we approach this, and actually really trying to solve these problems. I think this technology, more than anything I can think of, will improve the way we live and work. And so, yeah, when we met, I think we were still in that stage. A lot of people said, you guys have been in stealth for years. We had this view that, Boston Dynamics was a big inspiration to us. And Apptronik, the name was Applied Mechatronics. And so it was like, okay, Boston Dynamics showed us what was possible. And now we want to get this stuff from the lab out into the real world. So we're going to really focus on, what does that commercialization process look like to get humanoids into the world? And we're not going to show anything until we can have a video that beats Boston Dynamics. So, we're still working towards that. And so we eventually realized, as other folks came into the space, that you needed to be sort of telling the story along the way. And there was a little thing called marketing that we needed to, get better at. And so we've tried to find the right mix of, sort of vision and storytelling, with really being pragmatic about where the tech's at and where we're really at overall.
When that first Electric Atlas video came out, were you like, oh, shit?
No, I mean, I was the same way that I am now, which is like, that's amazing. Like, here we are. That's awesome. And, we have a lot of respect for what they're doing over there. They've had a few decades of a head start on us working on this, but I think it shows what's possible. And, I've gotten to know Mark Rabert over the years, and he's a special human. His view was to show the world what was possible in robotics. And I think he was successful in doing that because he showed us what was possible. So Nick, my co-founder, tells the story of, seeing big dogs slipping on ice, and just, this opened up his mind about, wow, like what is possible with these robots. And I think for a lot of us, those videos really pulled us into this industry and created a whole sector of entrepreneurs and engineers that wanted to work on these types of problems because they knew that they were possible. So no, I think it's awesome. It's great to see them pushing the limits, and we're trying to do the same. I think we'll show some really exciting stuff as well with our own flavor, as well as we move ahead this year.
Yeah, you hear all these stories about like Mark Rabert and Rodney Brooks and Gil Pratt and all these people, and they were all the leg laboratory 40 years ago at MIT. When you were really first entering the scene, or at least kind of being public about it in the way that you are now, did you feel like you were outsiders relative to that existing robotics community?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we were like the new kids on the block, and I always joke, you can either get patted on the back or patted on the head. Like, oh, isn't that cute? And we were more patted on the head early on, where people were like, rock on. But we, it was interesting to meet all of them. So we did feel like we had something to prove coming into it. We did feel like there was sort of the serious roboticists, and then there was kind of the fringe, humanoid folks, what I call the true believers. And But it was interesting. Everyone, the way that we were approaching it, we did get, once we had a chance to share what we were doing, we got a lot of respect overall, from the right people. And I think hopefully we've tried to build that credibility over time.
So when you talk about the fringe, are you including yourself in the fringe part of
Oh
things?
yeah, we were the fringe. Yeah, we were definitely the fringe. We were doing liquid cooled exoskeletons, even in the early days. Someone told me early on that all of our robots were avant-garde. And that was not a compliment, but we kind of wore that as a badge of honor. Um, we met Mark Rabert. He came to visit us, several years back, and he kind of lit up and he said, "You guys are technically fearless." And that, like I saw that in Nick, my co-founder, who Mark was a hero for Nick, and Nick just sort of beamed with pride. And like I said, we didn't know any better, but we were swinging for the fences. We were really trying to push the field forward. I sort of think of life in some way as like this relay race where, like, if you get the baton, then you just like run as hard, as fast, as far as you can with the baton. And then at some point you're going to pass the baton off to the next generation and they're going to run with it. So, we got the baton, and we're running as hard as we can with it while we have it.
Yeah, it's something that I'm sure everybody listening to this podcast knows, but maybe people outside of robotics don't know. When you look at like Mark and the robots that they were making in their labs before Big Dog, like they were avant-garde. They were making like weird robots in order to get to where they are now.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is to just, what Nick would say is we weren't doing things that were like weird for the sake of being weird. We were just thinking from first principles, right? So like, robotics was changing, moving from structured applications where you care about very high precision, repeatability over time, to unstructured applications where they're going to be mobile, where they're going to be around people. And so it actually, in our view, didn't make sense to kind of start from these old paradigms and these sort of existing requirements, of position control, into this new world. And so we were thinking about it in a very thoughtful way from first principles, but that was generating entirely new ideas, right? How could you make a robot lighter weight? How could you cool it in a unique way? What are other types of machines that are out there in the world that are achieving these similar properties? And so we were bringing a lot of ideas from outside of robotics into robotics, but we were trying to solve new requirements, and we felt like that required new thinking. And I think, you know, learning from folks like Mark Rabert and all the others that you mentioned. They were early pioneers, and we were really trying to, carry that to the next stage and pioneer in our own way, new ways of doing things without being sort of encumbered by the old ways that they'd been done, or by what people tell you can't be done or what is not possible.
Yeah. What does it mean to you to be fearless in this space?
I mean, I think to be fearless just means to not worry about what other people think, but to do things that you believe make sense, and to try new things, and to be brave, to push things forward. Like, I've had to learn to dial that back. I used to say if there was, 100 risks that we could take, we would take 101, and that was painful. And so you get smarter over time about like which risks to take and which things to be more conservative about. But and it wasn't that we were always fearless. I think early on there was nothing to lose, and it was just an adventure, sort of going after this. As the company grows, then you have to be mindful, right? You have other people joining you. You have families that are on the line. But I think it's about being pioneers, which is, the human spirit, right? Like these, I always thought of these robots as by humans for humans, right? Humans are tool makers, and this type of thinking is what's created human progress. This is evolution. And so we're trying to take that same spirit and I don't really know any other way of existing. This is just sort of how I think about the world, and trying to push things forward. What is progress, right? What do we do with our time? Our time here is limited. How should we use our time here? And what we want to do is make a contribution while we're here, and be brave about how we do that, and try to push us forward.
Yeah. So again, getting back to that, when we met at Automate, you come down the stairs, we have the conversation, we publish a story about it. So, in a meaningful way, like, you're public, you're out there in a way that you weren't previously. The instant that happens, does that change the math on your ability to sort of be fearless and be experimental?
I don't think so. It didn't. We were kind of already on this. We were already on this path. We did learn the hard way about being too risky in certain things. So it's really about like which risks do you take, and you don't take a risk just for the sake of taking a risk. We never did that. Nick would always say when I would explain this, he's like, it's not like we're just throwing darts at the wall and seeing what sticks. We're really trying to understand these ideas and these concepts at a really core fundamental level. And we're using that depth of understanding, that first principles understanding, to generate new ideas, but we're being thoughtful about how we're doing it. So I don't think that it did. I think I like to think that we're just growing through this whole process of trying to do the same thing we started with. Like, what is technology? Technology is the application of knowledge, right? What should we use our knowledge? What should we apply that knowledge towards? Like, we should apply that knowledge, in my view, to improve the human condition, to leave the world better than you found it. And so this was my dreams as a kid, and then this became my medium or my outlet to apply it, because I felt like when I was looking for something, and when I encountered robotics, when I met Luis and Nick, and when I saw Valkyrie, I thought, more than any other technology that I had seen, this maybe would be one of the most impactful things that you could work on. And I didn't appreciate the gravity of that early on. I actually became intimidated by that mission, a few years in. And then I sort of just accepted the responsibility of that, which is to say, we're going to go after this. We're going to try to use our values, our humanity. We're going to try to inject that into this. Will this be good or bad? Well, let's try to make it good. Let's fight for the light. Let's try to do this in the right way, with integrity, with humility. Let's take responsibility for what we're trying to pull off. And that's kind of been with us from the beginning. And, you know, we've learned from the school of hard knocks a lot of lessons along the way.
So what does that look like during that time period when you said that you were intimidated? Did that come with you kind of throttling back some of the risks?
No, I mean, for me, it was more like the interesting thing was, you know, I've thought of a lot of different ideas, right? I sort of think of myself as an entrepreneur, for whatever that means. I want to create new things in the world. And
I think you could safely say that you're an entrepreneur at this point.
Thank you. I wear that as a badge of honor and a responsibility for the other entrepreneurs that came before us. But what I realized the deeper that I got into it was I thought, these robots are going to be everywhere. One of the things with a lot of my other ideas was the deeper that I got into it, I would joke, you kind of sober up, right? You have an idea about something you want to do, then you test it in reality, and you realize, for whatever reason, that's not going to work. Or it's maybe you thought it was big, but it's smaller than you thought it would be. As I went on this journey, the deeper that I dug, the bigger I realized that it was. And I started to really think, you know, what won't these robots do in the future? You know, and so then what should robots do and what should humans do? And how do we shape this in a way that it's good for us long term, right? Science fiction warned us about all the ways that this could go wrong, but how do we make it go right, you know? And what does that look like? And so I sort of would say that you could be so intimidated by the ways that it could go wrong that you could get out of it altogether and just say, I don't want to do this. I don't want to open Pandora's box. Or you could say, well, because I have these feelings of trying to make sure that it goes right, I need to be in this fight, and I need to try to shape it so that it's a good future for all of us. And so I think of sort of our mission is robots for humans. What we mean by that is robots for the benefit of humanity. I sort of like to think of Apollo as the good robot, right? Like, what does the future look like? There'll be many different types of robots, but like what I hope to build, my ambition is to build the human helper, right? This robot that is designed by humans for humans. And that's going to start in, you know, these industrial sectors, but certainly if you think, you know, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, I hope it's in a whole host of different applications in the home, and, you know, hopefully taking care of my parents. One day, you know, these robots will be in the moon and Mars, you know, how else will we do it, right? And so if you take a long arc, then it helps me sort of make these decisions in the near term about how we get.
Yeah, I was speaking of being the good robot, and I think this was probably something I commented to you about the first time I saw it. It's wild to me that you're seen as kind of going against the grain or an exception because your robot doesn't look like it's going to try to murder people.
Yeah, that's an interesting, interesting how that's played out. Like,
Yeah.
I sort of had this joke of, you know, there's the feeling you have if you're in front of a single robot. How would you feel if you were in a room full of these robots, right? I also use something of, you know, the kid test. So it's interesting, you know, we came out of grad school. Many of us had started our families right when we started the company. And so we've seen our kids grow up with the robots, right? And it's an interesting litmus test. Like, how does a little kid view this robot? And in some ways, I kind of think of that as my target audience, right? I want this to capture their imagination and for them to feel excited about the future, and to want to be around these and work with these robots. And so, you know, this all stems from human-centered design. So we came from the human-centered robotics lab, and we've been thinking about, not just as a company, but all of the research roots that grew into Apptronik were about this idea of how will these robots work with and around humans. And so people sort of see the output of that as like, wow, you have a friendly robot. That seems obvious, but it was a part of the core DNA. And I think there's different motivations that come into this. I think now we've entered the space, we sort of transitioned from what I call the true believers, the people that would be working on this even if you didn't make any money, just because it's interesting and worth doing, to now we have, capitalism coming in where people see the size of the market and the opportunity. And, I was always very inspired by Apple, and Apple brought this kind of thinking into computing. And I always thought about what I wanted to do is I wanted to take those ideas. The way that I felt when I got my first Apple product was I felt grateful. I felt gratitude that somebody gave a shit enough to really design a user interface that I could use, and that they'd thought about the industrial design. And I felt really grateful that this was made. And like, that's what I want to do with the types of products that we make as well.
When we had that humanoid panel at Automate last year, like Melanie in particular was like coming in really hot about having the safety conversation, and it was great because I feel like in the intervening year or whatever that's transpired, a lot more people are starting to have that now, which is really nice. But you mentioned what we used to call elder care, what we call age tech now. So, like assisted living. And then obviously when people are talking about robots in the home, they're talking about robots that can, exist alongside like a toddler, for example. So these are arguably probably the two most vulnerable parts of society, right? The very young and the very old. So how can we get to a point where these, big metal objects don't actually pose a danger to humans?
I mean, that's the question that we're asking ourselves, right? So that's the question sometimes is the most important thing. And then we're developing the answers to that question. What does safety look like? How should we think about safety? What does it mean to be safe? What are different technologies that will enable us to be safe? This is why I say, like, I still think there's people doing really interesting work on this, like 1X, for example. I think some of the innovations that they've made in their robot have really pushed forward how you think about safety when you start to look at something like the home.
They're going like straight to the home. Like, God bless them. They're taking a different route than everybody else.
I think I really respect that. It's a bold choice, right? Talk about being fearless, going right after that. I think they're doing some interesting things there on safety, and I'm inspired by some of the work that I'm seeing from them and the ways that they're approaching it. So I don't think we have all the answers yet to those, which is why I think the home is a tough road right now. I think we still have a lot to learn about safety. A lot of people will sort of equate autonomous driving to robotics, and they'll say something like, look, if we haven't solved autonomous driving yet, how are we going to have these humanoid robots? One of the counters that I make is like, look, with autonomous driving, it's like that last 1% that you have to solve to put a car on the road with a family of 4. In robotics, the challenge is not the same. If I drop a box or I drop, parts in a factory, that's not great, but that's not catastrophic, right? The failure case is not nearly as bad when you're looking in these industrial environments as it is when you're in the home. And so I think, if 99.99% safe when you're at scale and you're dealing with toddlers and you're dealing with, your grandparents or your parents, that's tough from a commercial standpoint. We will get there. And as society, we'll make trade-offs, right? Benefit, versus the cost. But there's still a lot to learn. And I think a lot of great work being done both at companies and in labs.
Yeah, I mean, there's the dropping the box example, which, you're right, unless it's full of mustard gas or something, is, not really that big of a deal. But there is, I think, in much the way that even if autonomous cars get past that last 1%, like they're going to get in a crash. Somebody's already died. Somebody will die when it happens. A few years ago, I was covering all of the Peloton news. There were like stories of kids, like small children, getting injured in these treadmills. We know how to make treadmills. We've been making them for a really long time. They're out in the world. It's inevitable that at some point somebody is going to get hurt by a robot. How much does that set the industry or the category back?
Well, I think a lot of people have talked about this, but the bar for robots is much higher than it is for humans, which is an
Mm.
interesting thing. Um, I think it depends, right? I think it depends on how much value the robots are delivering overall. I think if robots can really deliver on the promise that we all see in front of us, then I think, I think if you think about just progress as a whole, like moving the ball forward, I think there will be some acceptance of that. But I do think you have to be mindful on the front end of this. So I think, um, that's where I'm sort of very thoughtful about how quick to go and into what industries, because if you do move too fast, like move fast and break things, is not necessarily what you want to do when you're dealing with, you know, toddlers and infants, for example. So you're balancing both of those things. But I think, just like the treadmill, just like cars are dangerous, right? People
Hmm.
die in accidents all the time, but they give us a benefit that outweighs the cost of cars. And I think robots will be a similar thing. And I think if you just zoom out, you think about how long we've been thinking about this as humans, and really just the short blip that we've even had robots all together in the grand scheme of things, I think all of this work will push us forward. And I think, we will have robots in every facet of our lives over time.
The first time I spoke with OneX's CEO, he pointed out to me that the company's name is a reference to the videos that everything is played back at 1x speed, which I really appreciate, because obviously that's not always the case with all the videos that we see. Something that Agility has been doing as they're scaling more and having these robots at shows is they did earlier this year, they did the kind of like the live stream of them in action. It's really important to be upfront about what you're actually giving people and to be honest about that with these videos. They're not car commercials, right? I mean, you need to show people what these things can actually do. How do you, as a company, how do you maintain that transparency?
I think the way you maintain transparency is just by being transparent. To me, I don't think it's that hard. I think you can have both. What I'll say is I was more in the camp of like the purist. Like what Nick's view was is you set up a camera on a tripod, you don't edit it, no cut shots, and you just film the robots doing what they're doing. That's one way of approaching it. But I do think you can have some marketing, right? You can make things exciting. You can tell stories and you can create a message, but you just have to be careful that you're not misrepresenting things overall. And so, like I said, I learned about marketing along the way. Like I don't. One of the things that I have learned, this is sort of a meta lesson, is sometimes you think things are a switch or like a button, like a one or a zero. Do you do marketing or do you do like, or
Like a
pure
binary choice.
a binary choice? But
Yeah.
it's actually a dial, right? It's like, to what degree do you do those things, and how far do you swing from one side to the other? And so what you're trying to find, as in most things in life, is you're trying to find the right healthy balance. But I do think transparency is really important, and I do think properly calibrating the public's expectations is in all of our best interest, right? If you create a massive hype cycle and you inflate expectations, even if we achieve amazing things in the near term, then they're not going to live up to this bar that other people think, and that's not going to be good for anyone. And so trying to find the right balance and sort of thinking about that. And I think, just the way that all companies work, different people will have different styles, and I think that's healthy.
Yeah, I mean, there's an inevitability. We are in a hype cycle, right? I mean, you can't. It's undeniable,
Yeah.
and there's an inevitability in which some of this is going to kind of regress to the mean, and all of the, there probably will be fewer companies starting out than there are in the space right now. Some of them will go away. Some of them will, like, I think Sanctuary is kind of more specializing in hands, which makes a lot of sense versus focusing on everything. But um, what are you and what is Apptronik bringing to the table that is giving you that longevity, that 5-10 year plan that we're talking about?
I think a number of things. I mean, what really focused on, in my view, the robotics is all about the last mile. So how do you deliver a real solution to the market? Um, Now you can vertically integrate to get to that sort of final solution, or you can partner. One of the things that we've sort of been unique about is we've partnered with different people along the way. Like I think these are really hard problems, and I have this philosophy, which is find the others, right? Find the other people.
Google, right? Google, that's the kind of the big one right now.
Yeah, exactly. And so Google is a great example. Like we're partnering with Google, and I think that I think of us as balancing big ambition with pragmatism in the near term. I think that my ambition is to build the best robotic products on the planet. Quality, user experience, safety of the robots overall. So there's certain things that we have today versus like what are we really focusing on for our competitive advantage in the future. Um, but we really want to build the best human-centered robots in the world, and that's and I think the way that we're trying to approach it, I think, is we have great customers, great partners that we're working with, and I think that's going to be one of the keys to longevity long term.
So there are certain and will probably always be parts of the stack that it doesn't necessarily make sense to do in-house, or at least like cloister yourself off from partners, including like this DeepMind AI element.
Yeah, I think so. And we'll see. We'll learn as we move ahead, right? This is I don't claim to have all of the answers, and as I learn new things, then my point of view evolves. But yeah, I'm very open-minded. I think it's important for us to partner with like-minded folks in the early stages, and our work with Google DeepMind team has been awesome. I feel like we're really mission aligned as well, and I think it'll be really exciting to show off a lot of the work that our collaboration is working on.
Yeah, so I'll leave you on this because we're at about an hour right now. But earlier you mentioned some too risky things, some risks that you took, that the company took, that were too risky. Do you have any examples that you can leave us with of just like total left field that didn't, in hindsight, makes absolutely no sense?
That list is long. I mean, some of these risks that we took, they make sense, but it's like a trade-off of, complexity sometimes, cost, and other times, we were really bullish early on in liquid cooling. So our first humanoid was liquid cooled. We had seen the work
like a PC.
Yeah, we were using actually PC liquid cooling. It was really science fiction looking. There's this dye you put in the fluid that if you shine a UV light on it, it glows. So these robots had these glowing,
they had blood.
Liquid cooling lines.
Yeah.
I mean, kind of had a pump in the center, and liquid cooling was one of those things that was really cool. You could get 3 times the power density out of a motor if you liquid cooled it, but way too complex, unnecessary to do in the first phases of getting this stuff to work. And the list goes on and on in terms of technologies we tried where we learned the trade-offs that we wanted to make as we moved ahead.
So you haven't completely abandoned the idea of liquid cooling then, it sounds like.
I think for certain joints, it could make a lot of sense, and it's something that's interesting overall, but you got to sort of build up into that complexity versus start with a lot of complexity and try to simplify down the road.
There you go. That was Jeff Cardenas of Apptronik. Thanks so much to him. Thanks so much to Apptronik. As always, thanks for watching and or listening to this episode of the Automated Podcast. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week.